Let's begin with a question that, perhaps, has crossed your mind during a particularly sleepless night. What did cavemen actually do when the sun went down? When the world around them grew quiet and the familiar flicker of fire was the only thing left to guide their way? Imagine for a moment the vastness of prehistory, not the grand events or the mammoth hunts, but simply the slow, uneventful hours after dusk, when ancient humans gathered together or sat apart, in silence or in soft, murmured conversation. Consider the gentle hush of a world without engines, alarms, or buzzing lights. Picture the simple act of sitting close to the mouth of a cave, feet drawn up, backs pressed against cool stone, the air thick with the scent of earth, smoke, and fur. How did they pass the time? What occupied their minds as the fire faded? Was there a ritual for settling in? Did they line up their sleeping places with care, or simply collapse wherever they felt most at ease? Did they watch the fire, letting their thoughts drift, or did they listen for sounds outside shuffling paws, the wind moving through grass, distant thunder, or perhaps the breathing of others nearby? Imagine, too, the long stretches between sleep and waking, the way they may have rolled and shifted, waking to darkness, then drifting off again, unhurried and untroubled by schedules. Did they talk? Did they whisper stories? Or repeat the same old tales, half remembered and slow? Maybe they counted the stars or tried to, losing track and beginning again. Maybe they watched the shadows on the cave walls, seeing shapes and faces in the flickering light, letting their minds wander down corridors of memory or imagination that led nowhere in particular. And what of their dreams? Were they filled with adventure, or simply with images of the day just past? How did it feel to fall asleep to the sound of breathing all around, knowing that tomorrow would begin as quietly as today had ended? Let's pause and imagine these moments, not as a rush toward discovery, but as a gentle, endless drift through the most ordinary, peaceful hours in human history. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky faded from gold to a dim blue-gray, the world of the caveman shifted. There was no real urgency to the night, no blaring signal to begin or end the day. Instead, there was a slow, meandering transition, as light gave way to dark and the activities of the day faded into quiet. Perhaps there was a faint sense of routine, or maybe not a gentle rhythm born from repeating the same actions, night after night, month after month, year after year. What, then, did those evenings look like, in all their uneventful sameness? First, imagine the gathering, sometimes in twos or threes, sometimes in larger groups, the way people might drift back to a favorite corner of a room, drawn by the comfort of company or the warmth of a shared fire. Maybe someone poked at the embers, arranging sticks just so, watching as a faint glow became a brighter flicker. There may have been a pile of dried moss or a blanket of animal skins, carefully arranged or simply tossed down wherever the ground was least uncomfortable. Did anyone fuss about whose turn it was to keep the fire going? Or did they just accept that sometimes the fire would go out, and that was that? Picture, if you will, the gradual settling in no pillows, perhaps, but a favored spot against a wall, or a shoulder pressed into the side of a sleeping friend. Maybe there was a faint shuffle as people shifted positions, a quiet cough, a murmur that faded quickly into silence. Sometimes someone might trace a pattern on the wall with a stick, not to create art, but just to pass the time, letting the motion soothe them as the light slowly faded. What of food? Perhaps there was a little left, a scrap of root or a bit of dried meat, chewed quietly, the flavor barely noticed. Maybe someone nursed a sore foot, turning it this way and that in the firelight. Was there a ritual to closing the day? Did anyone thank the earth or the spirits, or simply sigh, grateful for a full belly or another day survived? Perhaps some watched the last bits of light fade from the mouth of the cave, wondering if tomorrow would be just as uneventful, or if a change in the weather would bring new challenges. And what sounds filled the space? There was the crackle of the fire. Yes, and perhaps the distant howl of an animal, somewhere out there, far enough away to be interesting, but not close enough to worry. Sometimes, perhaps, there was the low, rumbling sound of someone snoring, or the soft whimper of a child dreaming. Maybe someone hummed very quietly the same tuneless melody night after night, a comfort without meaning. What of their thoughts? Did they wonder about the stars, or did they just accept them as part of the background, like trees or rocks? Did they ever think about the day just past, the small successes and failures? A missed rabbit, a found berry bush, a conversation remembered or forgotten? Maybe they thought about nothing at all, just letting their minds wander in the comfortable silence, lulled by the sameness of it all. Occasionally, perhaps, someone would ask a question, not for the sake of an answer, but just to hear another voice in the darkness. Did you see the way the clouds moved today? Do you think the river will rise? The answers, if they came, might be little more than a grunt or a nod, a shared understanding that words were not always necessary. And as the night deepened, the boundaries between waking and sleeping blurred. Some might drift off quickly, while others lay awake, eyes half open, watching the last sparks of fire fade away. The dark pressed in, not frightening, but familiar, a soft, ever-present blanket. If anyone woke, there was no clock to check, no urgency to return to sleep, just a gentle awareness that night would eventually yield to morning. Time moved slowly. Sometimes, perhaps, not at all. There was no need to hurry, no need to do anything in particular. The night stretched on, filled with quiet routines and the peaceful certainty that, whatever else might happen, there would always be another night, just like this one. And so, the world of the caveman at night was not marked by excitement or drama, but by the endless repetition of small comforts. The warmth of the fire, the softness of a sleeping companion's breath, the reassuring solidity of stone at one's back, and the gentle, meandering drift of thoughts with nowhere urgent to go. When the quiet of night truly settled, and all around was soft with darkness, perhaps the minds of cavemen wandered, drifting much like leaves carried gently by a stream. What did they think about, if they thought about anything at all? It's possible that their thoughts were not so different from the ones that pass quietly through your own head when you are lying in bed, waiting for sleep. Sometimes, maybe, the mind focused on small aches, a scrape on the knuckle, a bruise that throbbed a little in the cold. Or perhaps they wondered about the weather, feeling the weight of the air and the promise of rain, thinking only in terms of what would be comfortable, what might be dry, and where the best spot would be if the wind began to blow. Perhaps these thoughts were not urgent, just background, swirling around and around, never quite coming to rest. Other times, maybe they thought about the day just past, a memory of finding a smooth stone by the river, the way the light hit it, or the strange tracks in the mud that nobody could explain. Maybe there was a fleeting image of a bird flying low, or the soft crunch of frost underfoot, or the distant shape of trees swaying as the sun disappeared. Sometimes, a face familiar or not would float up from memory, then dissolve back into the shadows. Perhaps there were questions, but not the kind that need answering. Will it be colder tomorrow? Will the big deer come back? Did anyone notice the new crack in the cave wall? These are the sorts of questions that, once asked, do not require much in the way of resolution. They drift through the mind and are gone, like the smoke from the dying fire. It is also possible that the mind wandered to the small routines of comfort. Was the bedding arranged just right? Did the moss feel softer on the left side or the right? Was there a favorite position to lie in, a favorite spot to tuck cold feet, or a way of curling up that always seemed to help sleep come more quickly? Maybe the best nights were the ones when everything felt just right, but there was no particular memory of those nights, just a general sense of ease. Sometimes, perhaps, the mind was empty, content simply to exist in the space between waking and sleep, listening to the sounds, the steady rhythm of breathing all around, the quiet shifting of someone settling in, the soft hush of wind outside. the occasional far-off call of some animal unseen. All of these things blending together into a gentle backdrop, comforting in its familiarity. Did they ever worry? Possibly. There might have been small worries, drifting in and out. Would the fire last until morning? Would the water by the entrance freeze over? Would a favorite tool be where it was left when daylight came? But maybe these worries did not stick for long. With nothing to do but wait for sleep, the mind would likely circle back to comfort, to habit, to the small and unimportant details that fill up time without ever really mattering. Perhaps, at times, there was a moment of reflection. Did the day feel different from the day before? Or did everything blur together? One night into the next? One season into another? Maybe someone wondered if the stars looked the same as they did last week, or if the patterns above changed slowly, almost too slowly to notice. Or maybe the mind simply wandered with no particular aim, content to notice whatever presented itself, letting images and half-formed thoughts drift by like clouds. There may have been times when they listened to their own heartbeat, or the breathing of those nearby, or the gentle hum of the world outside. Maybe they counted breaths, or rocks, or the tiny sounds of insects. Or perhaps, with nothing but time, they simply let the quiet wash over them, becoming part of it. And sometimes, the thoughts might have circled back to memories of childhood, or of last spring, or of a hunt gone well or badly. Or maybe they thought about the color of berries, or the feeling of cold water on bare skin, or the taste of smoke in the air. But these thoughts, like everything else, drifted easily, never urgent, never sharp. The mind, left to its own devices, wandered and wandered. There was always another night, another set of thoughts, another chance for comfort. And so, the endless evenings stretched on, each one much like the last, filled with the soft, slow, repetitive drift of thoughts unremarkable, perhaps, but gentle and real, exactly as they needed to be. Night after night, as dusk faded and darkness pressed against the rough stone walls, the routines began. There were rituals simple, slow, and endlessly repeated that marked the path from wakefulness to sleep for cavemen and cavewomen everywhere. Nothing urgent, nothing forced, just the gentle, predictable flow from one moment to the next, like water trickling down a hillside, pooling here and there before moving on. Perhaps first, there was the rearrangement of bedding animal skins, layers of moss, a favorite stone for a pillow. There might be a small dance of shuffling, pressing the ground flat in just the right spot, seeking out the softest patch, plucking away a sharp pebble or a dried leaf that scratched against the skin. Every motion slow, unhurried, sometimes repeated for no reason other than the comfort of habit. Some evenings, maybe, there was a final bite to eat, a gnawed bone, a few dried berries, a scrap saved from earlier. The flavors were familiar, comforting, the act of chewing slow and rhythmic, something to pass the time. Maybe, in the quiet, there were soft sounds crunching, a sip of cool water, the faint sigh of someone content. As the fire burned low, someone might nudge a stick, coaxing the last embers to glow a bit longer. The fire's warmth wasn't just for heat. It was a companion in the dark, watching the play of shadows on the walls. Maybe tracing patterns with eyes half shut was its own kind of meditation, a gentle way to drift further from the waking world. The fire crackled, the flames danced, and for a moment it was easy to forget anything existed outside the circle of flickering light. Maybe there were murmured words, soft as the rustle of fur, exchanged between those nearby, an observation about the cold, a memory of the day, a half-formed question that never needed an answer. Or perhaps there was silence, comfortable and complete, where the only sound was the even, steady breathing of the group. Sometimes there was grooming, picking at hair, scratching a scalp, untangling knots. Fingers moved with patience and care, a quiet task that soothed both the giver and the receiver. The little details removing a burr, feeling the warmth of skin under fingertips, became the whole of the moment. The world outside faded to nothing. Inside was just the comfort of touch. Children, perhaps, curled close to parents or siblings, seeking out warmth and safety. A hand might rest on a shoulder. A body might shift in its sleep. A foot might nudge another in the dark. These small gestures, repeated over and over each night, were the silent bonds of family. No words needed, just presence and contact, enough to make the cave feel like home. Outside, there were the noises of the wild wind in the grass, the distant call of an animal, the hush of leaves. But inside, the cave was its own world, wrapped in layers of routine and habit. Sometimes, perhaps, someone listened closely to the sounds, trying to pick out meaning, wondering if anything out there threatened the peace. More often, the sounds were just background, as reliable and familiar as the pulse in one's wrist. Then, slowly, the body settled. Muscles softened, eyes grew heavy, breaths became slower. There was no rush. Sleep would come in its own time. For some, maybe it came easily. For others, after a long stretch of lying still, listening and waiting, thinking about nothing in particular. The rhythm was as old as the world itself. Each evening, the rituals were much the same, the patterns repeating night after night, until each person knew their part without thinking. Sometimes it rained, and the cave smelled of earth and stone. Sometimes the air was crisp and clear, and every breath felt sharp and clean. Sometimes a dream flickered at the edge of consciousness, but most of the time, the night was just night calm, dark, full of gentle repetition. Even as the world changed outside, the inside remained steady, familiar, endlessly looping through these quiet, comforting routines. There was a peace in the repetition, a certainty in the small acts that filled the hours before sleep. In the heart of the cave, with the fire dying low and the night deepening all around, the rituals of sleep continued, as they always had, as they always would. In the darkness, security was never a guarantee. Still, for those inside the cave, with its walls wrapped tightly around them, there was a sense of safety. It was as much about ritual as it was about stone and fire. Sometimes, a figure would linger near the entrance, perhaps pretending to stand guard, but mostly just letting their mind wander, lulled by the same sounds that soothed everyone else. There was no need for words about danger or what might be outside. Everyone knew, in some quiet part of their mind, that the night belonged to creatures that prowled, slithered, or swooped through the air. But inside, close to one another, wrapped in animal skins and warmed by each other's presence, the dangers felt far away. There was trust in the walls, trust in the fire, trust in the group. Maybe that trust wasn't always justified, but on most nights it was enough. Sleep never came all at once. It arrived in waves, gentle at first, then stronger, like a tide creeping up a sandy beach. Some people drifted off quickly, their breathing deep and regular almost as soon as they settled. Others lay awake, eyes open in the dark, tracing the cracks in the ceiling with their thoughts, waiting for that first moment when consciousness began to slip. There was no sense of urgency, just patience, the knowledge that night would last as long as it needed to. And in those in-between moments, when sleep was near, but not quite there, minds wandered. Maybe they replayed the day's events. A fire built, a meal prepared, a story told, the sound of laughter echoing in the stone chamber. Maybe, instead, thoughts wandered further back, to other nights, other seasons, faces that had come and gone. In this way, the mind was a traveler, drifting backward and forward through time, even while the body lay still. Dreams, when they arrived, were sometimes vivid and strange, but just as often, they were gentle and indistinct. There were no clocks, no alarms, no pressure to wake or to sleep, just the steady passage of hours, measured only by the slow brightening or darkening of the cave. Some dreamed of running, some of water, some of the warmth of the sun. Others remembered nothing at all, waking as if no time had passed. Sometimes in the quietest hours of the night, someone might stir, shifting in their sleep, perhaps startled by a dream or by a sound from outside. A murmur might ripple through the group, a reassuring pat on the back, a comforting whisper. And then the quiet would return, settling over everything like a blanket. The night belonged to the slow, steady rhythm of breathing, to the heartbeat of the group, to the patience of bodies letting go of the day. If there were worries about hunger, cold, or what tomorrow might bring, they softened in the dark, their edges worn smooth by repetition and routine. After all, every night was a little like every other, stretching back through time farther than anyone could remember. Outside, the world changed. Animals moved, the stars wheeled overhead, the wind shifted direction. But inside, time moved in circles, each night folding gently into the next. There was no hurry to sleep, no rush to wake, just the unhurried drift through darkness, surrounded by the warmth of company and the certainty that for a few hours, at least, the world was quiet and safe. For anyone lying awake in that stone chamber, the senses came alive in a different way. The world outside was hidden, but the cave itself was a world of its own. Even in darkness, there was always something to notice. The faint glow of coals, the distant echo of water dripping, the quiet shuffle of someone shifting their weight. Eyes, unused to the sharpness of day, could sometimes make out shapes bodies curled together, the faint suggestion of fur or hair, a pile of tools leaning against a wall. Sometimes a single thread of moonlight found its way inside, painting a silver stripe on stone or skin. Sound traveled differently at night. The cave seemed to gather up every small movement and hold it close, so that the tiniest rustle of a blanket, the slow exhale of a sleeping child, became part of a private symphony. Farther away, outside, a fox barked, or an owl called, or branches scraped together in the wind. These were reminders that the night was not empty, but alive with things unseen. No one jumped at these sounds. They were familiar, part of the same world as the people in the cave, as old and expected as the dark itself. The sense of smell was stronger, too smoke from the fire lingering in the air, the tongue of dried herbs or moss, the faint scent of damp stone. Sometimes the smell of animal fat or cooked meat still clung to fingers or hair, blending with the odor of earth and sweat. These were not unpleasant smells. They were just part of being alive, part of the simple, unpolished reality that everyone shared. There was a rhythm to these nights, a cycle that repeated, night after night, season after season. Some people would dream, others would watch the dark, and still others would wake and drift back to sleep in gentle, overlapping turns. Sometimes, someone might hum softly to themselves, barely audible above the low breathing of the group. Maybe it was a song passed down, or just a sound to fill the silence. Even the air felt different at night, cooler, heavier, still. It pressed softly on skin, moved quietly through the cave, brought with it hints of rain or snow or distant smoke. The darkness had its own weight, but it was not frightening. It was just the shape of the world after sunset, a gentle curtain pulled down over the day. Now and then, the fire needed tending. Someone would shift, add a branch, blow gently until the coals glowed brighter. Shadows danced against the walls, shrinking and stretching in strange patterns. For a moment, the cave became a theater of moving forms, long arms, twisting smoke, the suggestion of animals or faces. Sometimes a child watched these shadows, making up stories, or just letting their imagination drift, half awake and half asleep. If anyone worried about the cold, or the hunt tomorrow, or a missing friend, they did so quietly, holding their fears inside where they would not disturb the peace. The group was used to waiting, to patience, to the slow unwinding of each night. There was no sense of wasted time, no pressure to be productive, only the slow, circular passage of hours. For the ancients, night was not something to fight against. It was a gift, a pause, a softening of the world's edges. If the body ached or the mind wandered, That too was accepted, a part of the flow of days and nights, each blending softly into the next. In this way, sleep was not just a break from life, but part of it, a quiet, shared journey through darkness and dream. As the hours deepened and the last murmurs faded, each person slipped further into their own quiet world. Even if eyes were closed, the mind did not always rest. Thoughts drifted, slow and looping, not about great deeds or distant places, but about the everyday things that made up a life. Was the pile of wood by the fire enough to last till morning? Would the weather hold? Or would there be rain? Had someone remembered to move the meat away from the damp corner? These questions were like soft stones, smooth and familiar, turned over and over in the mind's hand. There were small, private rituals, two gestures repeated night after night. Someone might press a treasured object, a bit of bone, a carved bead, a lucky stone into the dirt beside their sleeping mat. For some, it was a way to remember someone gone. For others, it was simply habit, an act that made the darkness less lonely. Sometimes a hand brushed against another in the dark, not by accident, but as a quiet reassurance. I am here. You are not alone. These touches were never spoken about. They belonged to the night. Others passed the time with half-remembered stories. The oldest in the group might whisper a tale to a child, or even to themselves, about an animal that was not really an animal, about a time when people were made of light, about a hunt that never ended. The stories didn't need to be true, or even finished. The act of telling was enough, a gentle thread tying the night together. Often, no one listened but the storyteller, and that was all right. Some nights, someone would quietly mimic the calls of animals, the whine of a wolf cub, the low hoot of an owl, the scratchy hiss of a lizard moving over stone. These were not performances, but small acts of remembrance, a way to keep the world close, even when hidden in darkness. It was a reminder that life outside the cave went on, that the night belonged to more than just people. For those who had trouble sleeping, the time was filled with small, almost invisible tasks. Someone might rebraid a strand of cord, feeling each twist in the dark. Another might arrange their tools, not to use, but simply to feel the weight of them, proof that tomorrow would come, and with it, new work. These acts didn't disturb the others. They were quiet, careful, as much a part of the night as breathing. Every so often, someone would leave the cave for a moment, maybe to check the path, or just to feel the cool night air on their face. They moved carefully, slow and alert, listening for any sign that the world had changed. Most of the time, they returned with nothing to report, except the simple relief that all was as it should be. A brief glance at the stars, a quick scan for animal eyes shining in the dark, then back to warmth and the steady hush inside. The language of the night was mostly silence, punctuated by the softest of sounds. A sigh, a whisper, the crackle of cooling embers. Even dreams, when they came, were quiet images flickering behind closed eyes. Stories that made sense only in the darkness, half remembered by dawn. Sometimes someone would mumble in their sleep, and the others would listen, but no one ever laughed or woke them. Night was a time for kindness, for patience, for letting the world be slow and soft. And so the night moved on unhurried, unbroken, a gentle tide carrying everyone just a little closer to morning. Night inside the cave was not silent, not truly. The sounds changed, but they never stopped. Sometimes the wind outside found its way in, threading through cracks and hollows, making low, humming music no one had a name for. Sometimes a branch or pebble fell outside, making the hearts of the lightest sleepers jump, their hands tightening around a stick or a stone until they heard the next familiar breath beside them. Then their fear faded, the quiet trust of the group stronger than any shadow. A child might whimper in sleep, caught in a dream of something chasing or something lost. A parent, or whoever was nearest, might press a palm softly to the child's back, a wordless signal that here, In this pocket of warmth, nothing could truly harm them. If the child woke, no one scolded. Instead, they might be rocked or whispered to, the way people always have, with half-remembered songs or words that didn't need to mean anything at all. It was the tone, the lull, the reassurance that mattered most. Even among the oldest, the night sometimes brought memories that needed gentling. There was no shame in this. The darkness made people equal. In these hours, people watched the play of shadows on the walls, cast by the smallest embers. Sometimes the shifting shapes became part of the conversation, silent, but shared. Someone might trace a finger through the air, following the outline of a shape, a bison, a bird, a hand. They might share a look with another, half a smile in the dark, an invitation to imagine together. In this way, stories and pictures and memories were layered onto the cave, becoming part of its silent language. The walls themselves were witnesses to hundreds of such nights, bearing the touch of many hands. It was not only people who occupied the cave at night. Small creatures sometimes slipped in, mice, nosing through old bones, a beetle tracing a line over rock, a moth fluttering silently near a patch of lichen. Most of the time, no one paid them much mind. Occasionally, a child would watch, eyes wide, following the soft scuttle until it disappeared into the dark. These small visitors were part of the order of things, neither feared nor welcomed, simply present. Some people, lying awake, thought of those not their relatives gone, companions lost, friends left behind at other fires. The night was long enough for remembering. Sometimes, if someone felt moved, they'd whisper a name or a wish for safety. It was not prayer, not quite just a way of keeping connection alive, even across miles or years. The group itself shifted and changed during the night. A baby born, an elder gone, a stranger welcomed, a friend left behind. Such changes were always recent somewhere in memory. The night was a time to let these changes settle, to feel both the loss and the comfort of the group's steady breathing. Sometimes, two people who'd quarreled in the day found themselves lying side by side. No words were needed. The darkness pressed gently on old hurts, and in the morning, things might be softer. Each hour had its own feeling. Early night, people were restless, full of the day's leftover energy. By now, the cave felt heavier, as if the earth itself were pressing everyone toward sleep. The cold was less sharp, the world smaller and safer. Only the bravest thoughts or the deepest memories moved much at all. Sometimes a quiet word or gentle laugh might drift across the cave, but most things waited for morning. Night was when care for one another was most visible, even if no one would speak of it come daylight. Sharing warmth, sharing space, sharing silence. These were the bonds that made life possible, even when nothing else was sure. The night's deepest hours gathered close, dark and slow, carrying each person just a little further towards sleep and the soft hope of another day. As the hours slipped by and the world outside remained silent except for the distant echoes of wind, most in the cave drifted at last into true sleep. This was not the quick, uneasy rest of dusk, but the deep, enveloping quiet that came when even the embers faded low and the outside world held no light. Bodies curled more tightly, one against another, instinct pulling knees up, arms folded in, heads close. Sometimes a hand found another hand, fingers tangling unconsciously. But sleep was not a private thing in the cave. It was part of the night's shared story. Breathing mingled and set the rhythm of the dark. There was a comfort in this knowing that one's own sleep was stitched together with the sleep of others. If one person startled awake, often another did as well, two hearts thumping, listening for danger that almost never came. Dreams, too, belonged to the night. People in the cave dreamt not only of the day's struggles hunting, gathering, walking for hours, but also of stranger things. Some dreams held faces and voices from far away, or brought back lost animals, or replayed the sharp edge of a storm, the scent of a distant fire, or the flash of a bird's wing overhead. These dreams weren't always pleasant. Fear could visit as surely as warmth. Yet inside the cave, with so many close by, even frightening dreams faded faster. Older people sometimes woke in the night, eyes open in the dark, letting their minds wander to memories as vivid as dreams times when they were strong, or when the group was larger, or when the world outside felt different. They did not wake others. Instead, they might reach for a nearby stick or a smooth stone, running their hands over it, reminding themselves of the world's solidity. Sometimes in the hush, an elder would murmur to themselves, a lullaby of old words that no one else quite understood, but that helped them let go and drift back to sleep. Children often turned in their sleep, small sounds escaping as they worked through the day's stories and worries. Sometimes a grown-up, awake and listening, would shift quietly to lay a fur back over a child's shoulder or tuck their feet in more closely. There was no schedule for such care. It happened when needed, and the group absorbed each gesture into the gentle rhythm of the night. Not everyone slept all at once. Someone, by choice or chance, would always be awake for a time, keeping a quiet watch. Their eyes moved from the slow rise and fall of chests to the darkness just beyond the cave's mouth, waiting for any sign of danger, of dawn, of change. Most nights, there was nothing to see but darkness and the faintest outline of rock. But the act of watching itself was a comfort, a way of weaving protection out of attention. The cave at its deepest night was not empty, but full with breath and memory, with warmth and fear, with dreams and the hope of morning. Even as people slept, the fire of their presence kept the space alive, holding back the dark a little longer. As night pushed on toward its last, quietest hours, the cave seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the faintest change in the world outside. Dreams faded, bodies shifted, and the promise of morning, though still hours away, became, slowly, imaginable. The last stretch of night inside the cave was the most fragile. Here, the difference between sleep and wakefulness blurred. People stirred without quite knowing why muscles flexed. Hands reached out for a fur or a stone. Feet shifted under rough blankets of hide. The darkness felt less absolute now. Even without opening their eyes, some sensed that morning was near. There was a subtle difference in the air, a softening, a faint coolness, the tiniest change in sound from outside. Some were light sleepers, and they awoke just enough to turn over, listen, and slide back into their dreams. Others found themselves awake and unable to rest, minds alert and waiting. They might listen for the changing calls of night birds, or the first distant noises of animals moving outside. These small signs mattered. A shifting wind, the scratch of an insect, the sigh of a sleeping child. All these were clues that the world was turning again. Still, most people lay as they were, wrapped in their own warmth, letting their senses drift. In these hours, the cave became a space of in-between. Not quite night, not yet day. For some, this time brought a gentle confusion, a dreamlike state in which memories, hopes, and the patterns of the stone ceiling mingled. Someone might reach for a favorite object, a carved bone, a lucky pebble, a scrap of dried leaf, and turn it in their fingers, remembering stories told in brighter hours. Slowly, as if the earth itself were breathing differently, the silence shifted. A parent or older sibling might open their eyes and see, just barely, the faint outline of a face beside them, or the pale suggestion of the cave's entrance. Sometimes in this quiet, a whisper would pass between two people, nothing urgent, only a reminder, I'm here. Even the smallest voice sounded profound in the pre-dawn hush. Beyond the cave's entrance, the sky began to change. No one could see it yet, but some could sense it, the way you sense rain coming or feel the ground cooling beneath your feet. It was not light, but a promise of light. The oldest members, those who had lived through many nights, trusted these signs. They had learned to feel the turning of time, the coming of the sun. They knew how long it took for night to empty itself, and for day to begin filling the world again. As people began to shift more often, the sleeping space filled with the subtle sounds of waking. A cough, a sigh, the soft thud of a limb against stone. Someone might rub their eyes, sit up, and pull the fur tighter, watching the dark for the faintest line of gray. No one rushed. There was no alarm, no bell, no schedule except what the earth provided. This was a time for listening, for feeling the world turn, for remembering that sleep was nearly over, and that another day was on its way. The cave, full of quiet, became a waiting place, balanced between the certainty of darkness and the hope of the coming light. Before the first line of true light appeared outside, the people inside the cave began their slow, silent rituals of waking. It started with breathing sharper, deeper, as lungs stretched and filled. Limbs cramped from hours on hard ground, extended, flexed, sometimes nudging a neighbor or stirring a pile of furs. Children rolled over, clutching for warmth, their dreams interrupted but not yet vanished. Some adults stayed curled tight, fighting the coming cold, unwilling to move until they absolutely had to. Someone, perhaps the one whose task it was to greet the day, might rise a little earlier. This person, elder, parent, caretaker, or just a restless soul, would feel for their furs and sit, cross-legged, on the cave floor, listening, waiting. Outside, the world was still wrapped in blue-gray darkness, the land shrouded in mist, and the uncertain glow of a sky not yet changed. Eyes adjusted to the slight difference, seeking the entrance where a breeze hinted at something new. The rest followed in slow sequence. A mother, an old man, a pair of siblings, the smallest child. Quietly, with little need for words, they would stretch, cough, shift, perhaps whisper a single name, or touch a sleeping friend's shoulder. Each movement was deliberate, unhurried. There was time nothing forced the pace, except the gradual brightening outside, which, like everything in this world, crept in tiny degrees. No one wondered what time it was. They trusted their bodies, the chill in the air, the far-off sound of water, the flight of a bird. This was not a moment for stories or laughter. Those would come later, around the embers, as the day advanced. Now, each person was inside themselves, noticing aches, hungers, and leftover dreams. Someone might reach for the remains of last night's fire, poking the coals, seeing if warmth could be coaxed from the ashes. Another pulled a fur tighter and closed their eyes, claiming a few more seconds before duty called. A parent might murmur a low song, wordless, soft, meant only for the child pressed close against them. This music was old as the rocks above, a comfort and a signal that morning was near. Outside, the air was changing. Night birds fell quiet. Insects began their slow, waking chorus. The smell of damp earth and stone entered the cave, mixed with the scent of smoke and animal hide. Eyes opened wider now. Someone yawned, shook their head, brushed hair from their face. In the darkest part of the cave, a pile of stones gleamed faintly in the dim light, marking a memory of yesterday's tasks or plans for later. The group did not speak, but their closeness, the tangle of sleeping bodies, the silent companionship made language unnecessary. They waited, for light, for warmth, for the moment the day would truly begin, and the rhythms of their world would carry them forward once again. For now, they lingered in that precious, thin space between night and day, together and alone, part of something ancient and unchanging. The first light. It did not arrive suddenly, but in a gentle, persistent seep through the cracks at the cave mouth. No one jumped up, startled or eager. Instead, every living thing seemed to register the change with the deep intelligence of a body that had never known clocks. The dark blue faded into gray, the outlines of stone and fur and flesh revealed in layers. All over the cave, people began to shift, some sitting up, some standing, some quietly rolling away from the others so as not to disturb, as if they understood instinctively that the smallest noises in the dawn had a different meaning than those made at night. Somewhere, far outside, a bird called a sharp, singular sound. It might have signaled danger or nothing at all. Someone closest to the entrance listened, eyes half closed, trying to decide if this was an ordinary morning or if the world outside promised something different. This, too, was part of the work of waking. To observe, to wait, to decide, even when nothing seemed to be happening. These were the real choices that shaped the day, not dramatic, not loud, but deliberate. Should someone step out to check for tracks? Should the group wait for the light to grow? Or start preparing food now, risking discovery by other hungry animals? There was no rush, but there was always a faint urgency. The old ones, those who had seen more mornings, sat quietly, listening to the wind and the sounds of sleep fading. Sometimes they hummed or clicked their tongues, marking time in a way older than language. Children woke fully, rubbing their eyes, their minds flickering from dreams to hunger to the promise of sunlight. The youngest might not even remember the dark night, was just a long, strange pause between the familiar acts of living. Now, the cave's heart beat stronger. Someone moved to the coals and began the ritual of coaxing a flame slow, practiced, a choreography of patience and hope. A dry stick, a bit of tinder, a careful breath. If it caught, a low, collective sigh might ripple through the group, a tiny moment of shared relief. Fire meant warmth, safety, food, and light. It meant one more night survived, one more day possible. As the light grew, every detail emerged. The walls of the cave, rough and pocked, carried shadows that danced and shifted. Bones and stones tools, keepsakes, small pieces of yesterday's meals lay scattered, each with a story that only a few might remember. The air smelled of smoke, earth, and something else, the subtle fear and hope that marked the beginning of every day. Some of the group gathered at the entrance, gazing out, scanning the horizon. The world outside was vast and silent, but full of promise and threat. Would there be animals nearby prey to hunt, predators to avoid? Would the weather hold, or would rain drive them deeper into the cave? They did not discuss these questions with words, but with glances, with the tilt of a chin, the angle of a spear, the silent agreement that formed in the way a group stands together. There was comfort in these rituals, even if comfort was never guaranteed. The act of waking together, of listening and looking and deciding, was as ancient as the rocks they leaned against. It bound them not with speeches or ceremonies, but with the simple knowledge that each person depended on the next. A glance, a touch, a shared morsel of food, these were the agreements that made survival possible. The day's plans were never written. They emerged as a series of small choices. Who would gather wood? Who would check traps? Who would watch the children? Who would risk venturing further into the wild? There was no map, no script. Each action was both ordinary and extraordinary, echoing through generations. And yet, in this fragile, sacred moment between darkness and day, the most important task was simply to notice, to observe the world, to feel the closeness of others, to sense one's own body alive and breathing. The earliest people knew, somehow, that being awake was more than having one's eyes open. It was the act of returning, again and again, to the world each morning, each sunrise, each unremarkable dawn. They sat together, or alone, at the cave's edge, waiting for the sun. Some prayed, perhaps not with words, but with posture, with hope. Others simply watched, knowing that the first light brought not just the day, but the ancient promise. Life continues for one more round of sun and shadow. As the sun rose fully at first slow, then suddenly bright, brushing the stone with color and the world with promise, the question remains, echoing gently. What did cavemen actually do all night? If you listen carefully, not just for answers, but for the texture of the night itself. You begin to sense how these ancient humans lived in a world governed by subtlety, patience, and the silent art of being together. It was never just about survival, though survival was a daily victory. Night after night, cave dwellers rehearsed rituals so fundamental that we hardly recognize them as such today. The art of rest, the negotiation of safety, the slow unfolding of trust and care. Some nights were restless, full of fear or hunger or cold. Others were peaceful, marked by the rhythm of sleep shared by an entire group, each person breathing in time with the darkness, dreams rising and falling like distant waves. Evenings became their own kind of education. Children learned what mattered by watching, by listening, by lying quietly beside those who knew a little more. There was always something to learn: how to hear a distant footstep, how to soothe a crying child, how to stretch a little food just far enough. At night, wisdom was less about speaking and more about noticing. The old ones knew. Sometimes the answer was simply to wait. Stories mattered, not because they explained everything, but because they gave shape to what could not be seen or named. The hum of a mother's voice, the gesture of a hand in firelight, the way shadows danced on the wall, these were the first teachers. Perhaps the most important work of the night was not hunting or inventing or even dreaming, but the slow, repeated making of meaning out of silence. That was the real invention, not tools or fire, but the shared act of imagining together, of believing that morning would come. The cave itself was a partner. Its walls sheltered, its ceiling echoed, its darkness pressed close enough to remind everyone of the world's limits and possibilities. The cold and the damp were real, but so too is the way bodies huddled together, warmth passing from one person to another in an unspoken pact. If anyone woke afraid, a hand or a breath or a wordless murmur in the dark was enough to say, "You are not alone." Dawn was not an ending, but a beginning. Each night spent in the cave prepared the group for the uncertainties of the day ahead. The wisdom of the night, the patience, the alertness, the habit of care, was what gave them the courage to step out, to face what waited beyond the sheltering rock. In this way, the night was not just an absence of activity, but a classroom for the future. For us, remembering these slow, attentive nights is more than historical curiosity. It is an invitation to rediscover stillness, to practice patience, to value the overlooked rituals of care and presence that connect us across thousands of generations. What did cavemen actually do all night? They lived fully, quietly, inventively together. They did what we still hope to do: keep each other safe, find meaning in the dark, and greet the morning with open eyes. So, as you drift toward sleep, let your mind wander back to that cave. Let yourself settle into the hush, the gentle warmth of others near, the slow unwinding of the night. Tomorrow, you'll wake, just as they did, carrying with you the wisdom of ancient sleep and the promise of another morning.